There's some people present in the circle. So there's conspiracy there. But Mary's on the co-op actually. Even at the very end.
It could be here. Well, Serene, I think you can. Well, there's not, but I think you considered order of performance, or. And I think we might stand. I don't know if you would like to stand to make the remarks, and then just answer questions here.
You mean over there?
Yeah.
To read?
To make
That's
your
fine.
initial remarks, and then we can answer questions here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think
That
that's
works.
fine. Yeah.
So I don't believe those are on. Rain is certainly affecting this, but that's okay.
Yeah.
You know what? Can I trouble you to put it at that end?
Where do you want it?
At the end. Yeah. That way we can. Yeah, that's good. I can poke John awake.
She said it's going to be 13 minutes. I really aimed for brevity, so I might not even fill up 30 minutes, and I hope that's okay.
13?
Yeah.
Or yeah.
Yeah,
That's
no,
what
I
you
think,
said,
right?
Yeah, 1-3, right?
Yeah, of course. No.
No, I think that's fine. I think most of us went for brevity, and I think it's better to have a conversation about
Yeah.
topics. So it's a better use of time. John, do you want some water? Bert, do you want some water?
Sure.
What time is it? It's... I guess not, because we just got the silence of
The communal
the
silence.
communal silence. You have a cup?
So, welcome everyone. For those of you sitting in the far back, if you like the couches because they're comfortable, that's great. But there's also lots of spaces up here, so don't be afraid to come closer and have a seat. I'm Serene Jones. I'm the president here at Union Theological Seminary, and it is my delight to welcome you to this evening's event. As you all know, it's the reason why you're here. It's a panel discussion entitled, "Is Islam a Religion? Islamophobia, Public Discourse, and the Idea of Religion." And this evening's conversation is important, indeed special, for many reasons. But one significant reason is that this is the first time that the International Institute of Islamic Thought, which you'll hear referred to as IIIT, and Union Theological Seminary, which is the UTS, so we're putting IIIT UTS, to go together on a joint panel discussing this important topic. And it's my special honor to welcome all of those who have come from the IIIT community to be a part of this at Union. It's a great honor for us to be doing this. One of the things that Union Theological Seminary and IIIT share is an intellectual realization that isn't always shared by the broader culture, and it is this, that what may appear to some to be obscure matters of religious definition, the things that you would study in a seminary classroom, like the question, is Islam a religion, which involves asking what a religion is, that these very obscure questions, seemingly analytically complicated but not necessarily interesting, inevitably have very significant political and social ramifications. And it is our good fortune to bring together a group of scholars who recognize that interconnection between theological claims and religious definitions and political and social realities. And we have here in this august group a set of scholars that are able to lay out for us, as it moves through many dimensions, not only of North American culture, but globally, the way in which these concepts interact. So I am going to turn over the panel to our moderator, who is also a very good friend of Union, the Rabbi Bert Batowski, who is the Appelman Professor of Midrash and Interreligious Studies at Jewish Theological Seminary, where he joined the faculty upon his ordination as a rabbi in 1977. He has been the dean of the graduate school and the founding rabbi of the egalitarian worship service of the seminary synagogue. And he now serves in this new position as the Louis Stein Director of the Finkelstein Institute for Religious and Social Studies at JTS, charged with programs on public policy. He also directs the Milstein Center for Interreligious Dialogue, and he holds degrees from the University of Illinois at Chicago, of Harvard, and at Jewish Theological Seminary. He has written many, many books, but what is particularly important for our conversations this evening is that I have had the privilege working with Bert over these last years on two important projects. The first was a series called Our Better Angels. It was a series we held at St. James Chapel in Lower Manhattan, also known as the 9/11 Church, on what, St. Paul's, excuse me. St. Paul's Church, part of Trinity Church there. And the point of the conversations, which lasted over 4 weeks, was to look at what our three traditions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, have to say about trauma and have to say about the religious processes of healing. It was to a sold-out audience and began what I believe to be an important conversation citywide about those topics. And he's also the director of a very important project on Judaism and Islam in America, which is co-sponsored by Hartford Seminary and the Islamic Society of North America, and it takes place at Jewish Theological Seminary. So, Bert, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Serene. I'm delighted, as always, to be here. You were lovely to do the shorter version of my bio, but you left off what I always count as one of my proudest accomplishments, which is I have been an adjunct faculty member here at Union since 1980. So I was watching Jerusha laugh when you said I've been on the JHS faculty since probably before Jerusha was born. So it's wonderful to be here, to be home, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing here tonight. First, let me just do some of the logistics of the evening. I'm going to introduce our panelists. Each panelist will speak for about 12 minutes and 30 seconds. And when they are done, you may notice there's an empty chair. One of our panelists is still on her way, so we're going to shuffle the order a little and put Linda Sarsour at the end. But after each of them has their turn up here to make a statement, we will then, I'm going to try and mix it up. I'm going to ask some deliberately provocative questions to see if I can get them swinging at each other and make it exciting. I want to welcome not only all of you who are here in the room, but I understand we're live streaming tonight, so those of you who are, curled up in bed watching it on your computers, welcome. When we have finished our conversation, each panelist having presented and then having a discussion in front of you, the ushers will be circulating with index cards on which you can write your questions. They'll bring them up to me, I'll sort through them, and we will have the opportunity to ask some of your questions to the panelists as well. We will end at 7:45. So let me now start now that I've said a few words, let me start my introduction. Assalamu alaikum. Islamophobic and anti-Muslim public discourse centers on a number of common themes, including ideas that Islam is not a religion, Islam is opposed to democracy and diversity, Islam is inherently violent, and we will unfortunately hear much more harping on these negative themes as election time draws near, because certain political candidates are willing to stoke fear of one American group against another and to play out Islamophobic themes in a very cynical attempt to win votes. These themes not only will provoke diverse public responses, but they raise important questions about the manner in which we teach Islam, the manner in which we conduct our democracy, and the manner in which we learn about religion in general. It is my hope that our panel tonight will provide an overview of the common patterns in Islamophobic and anti-Islamic and anti-Muslim discourse. We will, in the course of the evening, explore some of the political underpinnings, the impact on public and academic teaching about Islam, and the challenges it poses to the concept of religion itself in democratic life. Our panelists are in order as we go down the row. Dr. Ermin Sinanovich, who is the Director of Research and Academic Programs at IIIT in Virginia. And we're particularly grateful because I know you drove up today through the rain to be here. And there are a number of IIIT people here, and it's exciting to have you in the hall. Before he joined IIIT, he was Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Science at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. He studied for his MA and PhD in political science at Maxwell School of Syracuse University and has 2 BAs, one in Quran and Sunnah studies and the other in political science from the International Islamic University in Malaysia, as well as an MA in Islamic civilization from IIIT I'm sorry, I got to get it right. The International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization. That's ISTAC, also in Malaysia. So you've been around, and we're happy to have you here. To his left, not necessarily politically, is Dr.
Perhaps politically.
is Dr. Jerusha Lamptey, Assistant Professor of Islam and Ministry here at Union Theological Seminary. She earned her PhD in Theological and Religious Studies with a focus on religious pluralism from Georgetown University. She holds an MA in Theological and in Islamic Sciences from the Graduate School of Islamic and Social Sciences, and is the author of, here I hold up the card,
Good, yes,
the book is called Never Hold the Other, A Muslimo Theology of Religious Pluralism. This allows me to say that at the back table there are postcards for Jerusha's book, as well as a variety of publications put out by the IIIT, so you can get an idea of what the issues are. To Jerusha's left, John, are you there? Is Dr. John Tatamanil, Associate Professor of Theology and World Religions here at Union in New York. He writes on Hindu-Christian dialogue, on Buddhist-Christian dialogue. His first book on Hindu-Christian dialogue is The Immanent Divine, God, Creation, and the Human Predicament. Having said that and having invoked Hinduism, I also want to wish those who are Hindu or Sikh a joyous Diwali, which is just starting out this time tonight. John is a past president of the North American Paul Tillich Society, project director of the American Academy of Religion Luce Summer Seminars on Theologies of Religious Pluralism and Comparative Theology, and chair of the American Academy of Religion's Theological Education Steering Committee. Our fourth panelist, who inshallah will join us in progress, is Linda Sarsour. This is her bio. I'm hoping her words. She is a working woman, a community activist, and the mother of three. She's National Advocacy Director for the National Network for Arab American Communities, and Access, and locally serving as Director of the Arab American Association of New York, lots of letters, a social service agency serving the Arab community in New York City, a board member of New York Immigration Coalition, which is a coalition of over 200 nonprofit agencies serving the diverse immigrant communities of New York State, and the Network of Arab American Professionals New York chapter. So as you've heard, we have a really impressive panel, and I'm going to just ask everyone in the room, before I call Airman up to give his opening statement, to join me in what is now become one of the great American common rituals.
Oh, yeah.
Please turn off your cell phone. Airman.
Feel free to tweet, right? You can tweet. Just do it on mute.
Good evening. Assalamu alaikum. Greetings of peace to all of you. I was supposed to go second here, so I guess I'll have to break the ice tonight. I hope I'll do that well. And I would like to start by thanking the Union Theological Seminary, President Serene Jones, Dr. Jerusha Tanner Lamptey, and everybody else who participated in putting together this wonderful event, and I'm really grateful to be here tonight. Now, the question, is Islam a religion? And the issue of Islamophobia can be viewed from a variety of perspectives. I've decided to focus on the political aspect by engaging in an interpretive process that would allow us to unmask some of the political motivations behind hatred manufacturing. We can understand Islamophobia as mimetic, that is to say imitative, produced and reproduced iteratively across time and space. Susan Back-Morse, from whom this understanding is appropriated, explains that mimetic political practices are produced and reproduced iteratively, repeatedly, by building over time as they do across space. She uses the term in an optimistic manner, that is to say, iteration leads to transformation, learning from history, or remaking of the space. My argument is that mimesis can also be a degenerative, iterative process which seeks to replicate past hatreds and fears in order to facilitate exclusion, discrimination, and outright persecution. From mimesis, we obtain memes, and these have become popular in the internet age. That is to say, ideas, behaviors, styles that spread from person to person in a culture. So what are these memes that we are hearing about, that we often hear about Islam and Muslims? Well, here are some of them, and we've heard some of them actually in the opening remarks. Islam is a religion of violence. Islam is inherently violent. Islam is not a religion. All Muslims are not terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims. And I would like to pause here. There is an annual report that is produced by Europol. Europol is the EU version of the Interpol, which is the International Police Organization. And Europol every year publishes an annual report on terrorism in the European Union. And in that annual report, they give us the data and figures how many terrorist attacks occur in the European Union every year, and who are the groups and what are the motivations for these attacks. I've done some research on that, and I found that between 2009 and 2012, during those 4 years, there were about 1,230 terrorist attacks in the EU, or in the territories that EU covers. Out of those 1,230, if I were to ask you, what do you think, how many were committed by Muslims or Islamic groups or Muslim groups? I'm sure the answer would range, and you would try to be cautious, and many would say maybe half, others would say maybe a third. And the correct answer is 4. 4 out of 1,230, which is about 0.001%. And so the whole idea of not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims is easily empirically refuted, but unfortunately some people allow facts, do not allow facts to cloud their judgment. And so we have some of the results that I just mentioned. Some Muslims may be good people, but Islam is a horrible religion. That's another one that we often hear. And by repeating these statements in various formats and repeated by numerous people, the end result is the embedding in public consciousness of these negative images about Islam and Muslims. At this juncture, I would like to ask a question. Why are these statements repeated, and for what objective? Since my analysis focuses primarily on politics and political underpinnings, I will try to answer it in that way. And there are two, in my mind, main objectives here. In domestic politics, the goal is to disenfranchise Muslims by removing from them the rights and protections afforded by the US constitutions. And number two, internationally, the objective is to justify permanent interventions in and subjugations of Muslim countries. Just a month ago, a Republican state legislator in Oklahoma stated the following, and I'm quoting, "Islam is not even a religion. It is a social political system that uses a deity to advance its agenda of global conquest." And another similar statement made by another person reveals the objective of such mimetic practice. It says, "Islam is a complete geopolitical structure and as such does not deserve First Amendment protection." And here is where we get really at the core of that issue, why these Islamophobic statements are being made. These are, of course, often combined with negative ads about Islam, some of which are taking place here in New York City. And by combining negative stereotyping with repeated claims about Islam's unsuitable place in modern democratic nation-state politics, the Islamophobes are attempting to deny the Muslims those types of rights that come under the freedom of religion rubric in modern constitutions, and specifically in the US Constitution First Amendment protections. Another set of memes reveals mimetic nature of Islamophobic politics and one that has a firm root in the American experience. Recently, a lawsuit was filed on behalf of a U.S. citizen of Arab Muslim background who said he was called at his workplace a camel jockey. The place was a car dealership in Lexington, Kentucky, and he was often reminded by his co-workers that Arabs are the new, and they use the N-word. Now, I'm not an expert on the history of racism and slavery in the U.S., but when a group of people are called new N-word, in Kentucky, it opens up a range of possibilities with regards to exclusion, discrimination, and persecution that exposes the mimetic nature of Islamophobia within specifically American context in an unmistakable fashion. Mimetic experiences of Islamophobia, hence, are a regressive imitation of anti-black and Jew hatred practices in Western American politics. I have a picture, a cartoon, and of course there's a famous one with a Jewish person sitting on a big bag of money that was made in Nazi Germany, and which says underneath in German language, the God of the Jew is money, right? And then it is interesting to compare that to a more recent cartoon in which there is an Arab person sitting on a barrel of oil controlling, you know, the flow of oil in the world. Again, and the two people, because they are represented as Semitic people, look very similar to each other. So it is very mimetic, it is repeating and taking from history, and it's imitative in nature, and that is what I'm trying to really argue here. And this is not an accidental occurrence, nor is it occasional. Since 9/11, Southern Poverty Law Center has registered 30 new anti-Islamic hate groups in the U.S. alone. Center for American Progress published a study in 2011 which found that since 9/11, more than $40 million were given to various organizations that are engaged in Islamophobic work. Even more sobering was a report by CARE, the Council of American Islamic Relations, which stated that between 2008 and 2011, the inner core of the US-based Islamophobia network enjoyed access to more than $119 million in total revenue. In 2011 and 2012, 78 bills or amendments were introduced in 29 state legislatures and US Congress with the aim of vilifying and or outlawing Islamic religious practices. In 2014, so far, 37 anti-Islam bills were introduced in 16 US states. To conclude, the mimetic practice of exclusion and discrimination in this new iteration is but an echo of the old-seated hatred toward the other, which has its place in American political tradition. What we need is a mimetic practice to counter a mimetic practice. That is to say, reviving the best of the American spirit in the struggle against exclusion, discrimination, and persecution. What we need is also to revive the best of religious ethics. And since we are at the Union Theological Seminary, I will end with a brief contemplation on a passage from the Quran. In chapter 90 on the Quran, which is called Al-Balad, a land or a countryside or a country, the Quran challenges humans to attempt walking an uphill steep road, Al-Aqaba in Arabic. And what is that uphill steep road, the Quran asks, and then emphatically answers? It is to free someone from bondage and to feed in a day of hunger a nearly related orphan or a poor man lying in the dust. This uphill steep road, an orphan and a poor man lying in the dust, mentioned in the Quran, are powerful symbols of all our ethical aspirations to be kind to strangers and to free ourselves from the bondages of racism, exclusion, discrimination, and Islamophobia. Thank you very much.
You're going to flag me with my time. Okay. Thank you so much for coming. I should just say, this is working, right? Because from over there, it sounds As if it's not working. Is it working? Okay, wonderful. I should say that this event is of particular joy to me because, as was mentioned in my bio, I graduated from the Graduate School of Islamic and Social Sciences, which may not be apparent to everyone, but is the graduate school of IIIT. And so it's a great privilege to see kind of different aspects of my life coming together in one moment and to share that with a community I came from and a community that I am now a part of. So that's a beautiful thing. I want to pick up, and given that Linda is not here and she was going to talk explicitly about some of the manifestations of Islamophobia, I'm not going to do that. But what I want to pick up is on the idea of memes. And what I want to do is explore not only some of the memes and characterizations that are lodged against Islam and Muslims, but I also want to look at the manner in which we habitually respond to those accusations. And when I say we, I think one thing you're going to find about my comments tonight is that I'm going to be using some slippery pronouns because this is part of the issue. The question of who is we and who is us and who is them and who is they is, in essence, the issue at hand. But when I say we in this context as an introduction, I mean Muslims, people who detest bigotry, people who stand up against discriminatory practices. How do we respond to some of these accusations? I don't think that very many people, well, I guess this is my naivete. I was going to say very many people buy into the idea that Islam is inherently violent or Muslims are horrible people, but that's probably my naivete. Many people do actually buy that. And more than just buying it, many people actually act on it. As we just heard, the statistics on wanting to launch legislation to bar certain practices that aren't even being proposed to states is an indication that people do actually act on it. So what I want to do is a little bit of a systematic walkthrough of some of these tropes that are used and some of the ways that they are responded to. The reason why is I think that our response is not effective, that our stockpile of responses to these accusations are not effective, and we need to begin to think of new ways to respond. So I'm just going to walk through some of them. The first is one that Ermine already mentioned. Islam is inherently violent. Imagine that few of you in this room are unaware of this trope. It's been circulated widely since 9/11. It's been circulated historically with other groups to characterize them as violent. Oh, welcome, Linda's here. Please come. But it's also gained recently a lot of credence. I mean, you can see it even on what would be considered mainstream media, such as CNN, the idea, oh, yes, Islam is inherently violent, we need to talk about it, and then when we talk about it, we're going to talk about it afterwards and talk about how the person's behavior demonstrated, oh, yes, that's why people think Islam is inherently violent. So this is being characterized on CNN. I walked with my daughter today and saw it on the back of a bus out in front of the school. So this characterization is floated around. We're very well aware of it. But let's walk through it a little bit. This depiction comes out of people drawing upon certain events that have occurred. I'm not in the business of denying that there are not some self-identified Muslims who do violent actions and then say they're doing it in the name of religion. That's just not the case. There are some people who have done these actions. This particular meme uses that to its benefit. But what it does is it depicts the actions of this statistically small group, as was mentioned, or this statistically small number of occurrences as definitive of the essential nature or the core of the tradition as a whole. So it gets expanded to the whole tradition. Fine, not shocking. In doing so, however, there's something interesting that happens. Not only does it characterize the whole tradition as negative, but it does something to the voices or Muslims who say, no, that's not what I believe. What it says about them is that because Islam is definitively inherently violent, Muslims who do not say, oh yes, I agree with that, or yes, I am violent, or yes, I'm in accordance with that, it simultaneously depicts those Muslims as being bad or mediocre Muslims. What do I mean? Just put it in plain English. For people who circulate the meme that Islam is inherently violent, they also simultaneously circulate the meme that the only Muslims that are tolerant or peaceable or kind or friendly are ones that aren't really practicing their faith. Because if they really practice their faith and they really practice the core teachings, they would of necessity be violent. So the existence of Muslims who are tolerant and are peaceful and are ethical and are just does nothing to disrupt the meme of inherent violence. They're just mediocre Muslims. You know, that's just it. I guess I'm a mediocre Muslim with pride. It is important to note that the dual characterizations of Islam as inherently violent and the tolerant Muslim as a mediocre Muslim are voiced almost verbatim by another contingency, and that is Muslims who do voice extremist rhetoric. What do I mean? The rhetoric of Islamophobes or people who are promoting anti-Muslim views sounds almost exactly the same as the rhetoric of some Muslims who are promoting extremist and violent views. Why does this matter? Because it brings up a huge question about whether people who say, oh, Islam is violent and that's a problem, are really interested in dealing with that problem. Because in voicing the same rhetoric that some self-identified Muslims who advocate extremism and violence voice, they are inadvertently affirming it. They are inadvertently legitimizing it. They are inadvertently saying, oh yes, those people over there on the fringe, those very few, those are the real ones. We agree with that. They're the authoritative. They're the legitimate Muslims. Okay, fine. So what's the most common response to this meme? One of the most common responses to the meme of Islam is inherently violent is, oh no, Islam is a religion of peace. Right? We've heard this. You hear it every time something happens. This is not Islam. Islam is about peace. Many individual Muslims, many Muslim organizations, and allies of Muslims respond to the accusation of the inherent violence of Islam by asserting that Islam is a religion of peace. They proffer plentiful examples from history, from sources, from contemporary situations that would affirm this. While a response to this violence rhetoric, or the rhetoric of Islam being inherently violent, whether it emanates from people who are promoting anti-Muslim sentiment or people who are promoting extremist ideology, is absolutely vital. We must respond to it. This particular response of, oh, you say Islam is violent? No, really, it's peace, is highly ineffective. Muslims are called upon to denounce and condemn violence of other self-identified Muslims. And they do this in great breadth and frequency. And if there's anyone here tonight who does not know that, I'm happy to recommend you to all of the websites that chronicle all of the denunciations that every Muslim organization and many individual Muslims make over and over and over and over again. But the issue is that their denunciations carry very little weight, if any. They have very little effectiveness, and we need to ask why. It's not surprising that they're ineffective, because those who have adopted a violence rhetoric have based it upon the assumption that extremist Muslims are the only legitimate or authoritative Muslims. What does it mean? If you've already decided who can only be the voice of Islam, who the real Muslims are, then when these other ones that you will characterize as mediocre come along and say, no, that's not real Islam, how would you hear their voice? You would just say, oh, they're just saying that. They say anything. They're not saying the real teachings about the religion. This response, however, is also problematic for another reason, the response of Islam as peace. It shares a particular defining characteristic with violence rhetoric. Both this call to violence is inherent in Islam and the response of, oh no, Islam is just peace, depict Islam as a monolith. Whether of violent or peaceful nature, both of these presentations depict Islam as being singular. Islam is one thing. There is one real Islam. There is one true Islam. Now, one will say that the real and true is violent, and one will say the real and true and singular is peaceful. What happens then is contestations over the real nature of Islam, or who is not a real or good Muslim, become contestations over this supposed singular entity. Islam in both cases is just one thing. This is evident when people and institutions respond to accusations of inherent violence or calls to denounce Muslim perpetrated violence by stating that the actions of those people are not Islam. They could have nothing to do with Islam. Now look, there is an appeal to this very neat and unequivocal rhetoric. There is an appeal to when people say, and I have it all the time, I go and talk and people say, explain to me, prove to me that Islam is not violent. Prove it to me. I mean, it's setting up a thing that you cannot prove. It's not a good proof, okay? But the demand is placed to prove it. So I understand the utility and beauty and appeal of responding to that by saying, that stuff has nothing to do with Islam. That stuff is not real Islam. Those people are not real Muslims. But the problem is we become parrots of the same monolithic presentation of Islam, where Islam can only be one thing, and Islam has an agency unto itself, and Muslims are one thing or they're not Muslims. And that obscures all of the diversity of the tradition. And it obscures all of the diversity of the people within the Islamic faith. And some of those people are wonderful, and some of them are not quite wonderful. And some of them do everything lovely, and most of them don't. And, you know, there's all this wonderful diversity that is just pushed out of the window, both in the accusation and in the attempt to lodge a rebuttal to the accusation. This presentation, therefore, comes with a lot of baggage that we may not be willing to really accept if we start to probe it. So what's this baggage? I just mentioned that it obscures the reality of intra-Islamic diversity. But it really goes beyond just obscuring it or pretending like there's not many Islams. There's just one. And it could be a nice one or it could be an ugly one, but it's just one. It doesn't just obscure that that's not the reality. It delegitimizes internal diversity, okay? So diversity is not something that should exist. There can be one way or deviation from that. But this diversity, whether cultural, legal, theological, has always served as a resource for renewing Islamic thought and enactment. For instance, today it's a vital resource for scholars and theologians engaged in liberative and feminist rereadings of the tradition. For people who don't want to say, I mean, as a feminist theologian, I don't want to say the tradition is singular because then it's going to be singularly patriarchal and I have nothing else to say about it. The diversity has been a resource. And sometimes when we respond, especially with statements of peace, we obscure this very valuable resource. I have many other things I want to say, but they'll come up in the comments, but just let me make one final observation. When it comes to how we can then respond, we need to really think hard on the hidden implications and underlying assumptions of our responses and consider whether that accompanying baggage really is effective in the long run. Does it really help us to do what we want to do and be what we want to be, which is frankly accepted for a diversity of existences? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm delighted to see that our colleague Linda Sarsour has managed to swim here. So we're going to invite you up. And Linda, we're barely going to give you a moment to catch your breath because we'd like you to come right up to the microphone and do your thing, which you do so well. Just so you know, I'm giving everyone 12, yes, while you dry off, indeed. I'm giving everyone 12 minutes and 30 seconds. So you're up.
I'm going to run back and get myself more than 12 minutes and 1 second.
And you can time her. She will. She's real good.
20 minutes and 12 minutes. 20 minutes and 12 minutes, not from Brooklyn seconds. Anyway, good evening, everyone. I absolutely did swim here, so if my jacket looks iridescent and it's different colors in different places, those are the wet spots. So my name is Linda Sarsour. I'm the executive director at the Arab American Association of New York, and I'm a senior strategist on a campaign called the Campaign to Take on Hate. First, I'd like to be totally transparent. I am not a theologian. I am not a religious scholar. I am standing here as a Muslim and would like to share my experience and my perspective and my observations as a person who follows the Islamic faith is a New Yorker and currently lives and resides in Brooklyn, New York, and is an American citizen. Even the title of the panel, when I saw it, it was really, for me, it's one that's been used quite often in many panel discussions and debates. We've seen it in that very infamous debate with Mehdi Hassan in the UK around, is Islam a religion? And that's something we hear quite often. So even the premise of that question for me is really problematic, but it is something that's in the discourse right now. I don't think Islamophobia in itself is something different. We have anti-Semitism, we have hate against other faiths, other ethnic groups, other communities. But I think what's different for me now around Islamophobia and anti-Muslim rhetoric and sentiment is that right now we live in a country where that's acceptable. So when you have a pundit on national television using, for example, the N-word, or even making, inflammatory anti-Semitic statements, I guarantee you there's going to be a big uproar. That person pretty much might lose their job. But when it comes to Islamophobia and anti-Muslim rhetoric, it's actually really acceptable, and it's actually the liberals versus the right wing. They're like competing to see who could be the most Islamophobic. And most often, if they were a pundit, they suddenly become a host of a show, as if people are being rewarded for how anti-Muslim they can be. There's other parts of the discourse, this other idea that we can't be patriotic, right? So when I'm an activist and I'm talking about upholding the civil rights of Muslims, but also other communities, all of a sudden it's like, oh, you're not patriotic. You don't appreciate the democracy that you live in and the freedom that you have in this country. And what I always explain to people is that the fundamental fact that I'm using the very rights that this country afforded me, and I'm asking to make sure that those rights are upheld of Muslims and all people of faith backgrounds, actually makes me pretty darn patriotic, and maybe more patriotic than the people who are questioning my patriotism. And that's something that I come up to very often as a woman who is Muslim, who's like, you don't even have rights in Saudi Arabia. Well, I don't live in Saudi Arabia, and if I wanted to live there, I probably would have, and maybe that's why I don't live there, and I live right here in the United States of America. This other idea that we don't belong here, as if like on 9/11, like 13 years ago, Muslims suddenly showed up, like we just like magically appeared, right? No, not exactly. And like Islam is like a new phenomenon, like it's something new, like we just found out about it, it's not like it's a centuries old faith. But even in the context of American society, sorry that you don't know a lot about Islam. Well, you should have learned your history, because Islam has been in the country since the days of the slave trade. That Islam is as old as the country that we live in. And if that's not something that you were taught in school, I apologize. There's a lot of things we haven't been taught in public education. But the idea that I have to explain to people that Islam is not a new faith to the United States, that it's not something that we should have to explain, or whether it's a faith or not. I mean, there are 1.8 billion people in this world that follow the faith of Islam. There's probably some good reasons why they do that. We might want to think about that and not ask, why are 1.8 billion people following this particular faith? And the interesting thing to me, and the things that I observe, is that Islam is perfect. There's everything about it for me is perfect. But believers and people are not perfect. And the fact that with Islam, it's the idea of looking directly at the faith and not separating the faith from the people is very problematic for me in the discourse. We don't do that for other faiths. But with Islam, it's like, we have some, 1.8 billion people, and there is, even if it was like, I don't know, I'm making up numbers now, even if it was 500,000 people that were going crazy around the world, right? The fact that there's no separation of individual acts or small groups of people, that we have to use our entire faith to prove to everyone that our religion is peaceful. I don't even like to say that Islam is a religion of peace. I am one of the people in our community, actually, both on the local and the national level. I get really upset when imams feel compelled to have to stand up and condemn all these different acts that are happening every day. Like, for example, today, as you're sitting here in this room, there's a man in Ottawa, Canada, who just shot a soldier. Okay, of course, he, 3 days ago or something, I'm just kidding, I'm exaggerating, but he converted to Islam. So now, you know what's going to happen. The first question always is, where are all the Canadian Muslims that are going to come out and condemn this act of violence? And the other thing also about when we talk about, the context of terrorism or counterterrorism and looking at it from a, religious place, I mean, for me, living in a community and watching people almost go to their knees they're basically fighting each other to see how loud their voices can get. And what ends up happening is you find a group of people almost like screaming into the abyss, right? And we still get questioned about where are all the Muslims condemning terrorism? We have our national organizations writing statements like every day and people doing press conferences all over the city. And my question, though, and I sit back and it hurts me, and it hurts me as a young person that's trying to motivate young people in our community. I don't want people in our community or young people to be ashamed to be Muslim, or I want to get them out of this context that they always have to be on the, you know, we have to be, like, our kids are always like ready, like, oh, please, like, don't make that guy be Muslim, or please don't make them Muslim. And it's like, do other people ask those questions? Recently, I wrote a piece for the New York Times in Room for Debate about ISIS, and one of the things, you know, my whole thing was like, to be honest with you, like, when I condemn terrorism as an American, as a human, right? I don't condemn terrorism as a Muslim. And the fact that we are asked to do that as a Muslim community is something that is really problematic. And what I said was, I don't see Christians standing up and condemning Christian militias in Central Africa. I don't see Buddhists condemning Buddhist extremists who are massacring Muslims by the droves in places like Burma. We don't ask, you know, Christians to stand up and, you know, against the Westboro Baptist Church, and we already know, it's almost like second nature that I don't think that people in Westboro Baptist Church represent Christians. But when it comes to a couple of, you know, people that are misguided or whatever their ideology is or wherever they got it from, then all of a sudden this entire faith gets put on trial. And then it is ordinary people that get to decide whether my faith is peaceful or not. And the fact that I even have to say my religion is peaceful is in itself really problematic. Some of the other rhetoric that I hear is that, you know, you can't be American and be Muslim. Like, it's like one or the other, right? That Islam and American democracy like don't go hand in hand. Like, it just doesn't make sense. Even if you said that, it just doesn't make sense to us. And we see that in many states around the country where people are trying to pass anti-Sharia laws, right? Like, people are systematically, right, trying to legislate to ban Muslims from practicing their faith in its entirety, right? For me personally, when we think about the founding of this country and why this country was originally founded, was for all of us, for anyone to either practice or not practice your faith and be able to do that or not do it, right? That's why we're here, and that's why many of our ancestors came here. So the fact that in our country we have more than 20 states where there are legislations on the table called anti-Sharia bills, or in some states they're a little bit more like communication savvy. They call them anti-foreign law bills, but what they really mean is that it's very focused on, you know, Sharia, who, by the way, is a whole other panel. Like, what is Sharia exactly, right? Sharia is just the way of life of Muslims, and it's kind of something like a doctrine that we go by. It's nothing special or particular to Muslims. That we use canon law in this country, and we use other types of religious law that is accepted by some of the American courts. Anyway, so this in itself, to me, you know, we live in a country where, again, this is the founding of our nation. These are the ideals of this country, right? And we are proud to be Americans because we have, you know, good old religious freedom here. But I don't also see an uproar and people being like, absolutely not on my watch as an American. I won't allow them to pass anti-Sharia bills in my state. The other new phenomenon in this country also, which didn't happen like days or weeks or even the first couple of years after 9/11, right? When people expected to be even more backlash against American Muslims, right, is mosque opposition. Like, my parents been in this country for 40 years. We never saw people protesting the building of mosques, right? We saw this right here in New York City. If it's happening here in New York City, in supposedly the most liberal city in the country, we saw it first in Ground Zero, or whatever the quote Ground Zero Mosque, I didn't make that name up, you know, in downtown Manhattan. We saw it in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn. We saw it in Midland Beach, Staten Island, right? The fact that in our most liberal city in the world, I think anyway, or I think sometimes I question that sometimes depending on the day of the week, but in general, we're pretty liberal and progressive, right? We have people who continue to oppose the building of Islamic centers and mosques all over our city, all over our country. Dozens. Every day I hear in Michigan, Sterling Heights, in Temecula, California, in Florida, in Texas. I mean, the fact that we, as American Muslims right now in this country, in many parts of the country, we are fighting just to build institutions to pray in, right? Which is the right of every American to be able to do, as long as you're following zoning laws and whatever other requirements there are. But it's happening. And for me, the thing that really, you know, bothers me, you know, personally, is that there isn't a big outrage of the majority of Americans who we know for a fact are not anti-Muslim, that are proud to be Americans and value the very freedoms and the rights that are afforded to all people in the U.S. But we got to a place where, for some reason, and I think it's the political context that we live in, especially with the recurring everyday things that are happening, 5,000 miles away from us, that comes into our society, and people are then questioned about their patriotism as non-Muslims if they are to say anything that might seem that you're siding with American Muslims, when in fact all you're doing is asking for the rights of Muslims to be upheld just like for everyone else. In this country, sisters and brothers, justice is justice for all. Justice is not just us. That's not how you spell the word. So for me, it requires that all of us are courageous enough to interject, to interrupt the current discourse that is happening, whether that be in our private lives, with our colleagues at work, with our families, in our seminaries, in wherever you are, because it only takes that. And I'm going to end by telling you quickly about our campaign to take on hate. People were like, why campaign to take on hate and why now? Campaign to take on hate, we did listening tours around the country. We went to 14 cities to visit Arab American communities across the country. And we thought we were going to hear healthcare access and, we need more services for our communities and we want this and we want that. In every city that we went to across the country, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim sentiment, hostile environments, bullying in the school systems, right? Women going into government agencies not feeling like they were being served. So this idea of bias and hate and discrimination, it was in every single city that we went to. And we're talking anywhere from New York City, Chicago, Houston, Texas, Orlando, Tampa, Anaheim, San Francisco, San Diego, you name a pretty metropolitan city, we were probably there, meeting with focus groups from across the country. So the campaign to take on hate emerged out of that. And it was our way to put out a brand, which we're calling Take on Hate, which we believe is something anybody can pick up. I think that, generally speaking, hate is a bad thing, and together we should be taking on hate. But it's also a way to learn about things you don't know about, like Arab Americans and Muslims and refugees. Arab Americans and Muslims are not the same thing. The other last point I want to make also so takeonhate.org, visit us, learn more about what we're doing. And the last thing I want to say really quickly also about Islam in America right now. Why do we find Muslims in many social justice movements, and many of us considering ourselves communities of color? Although we have a huge population of Black American Muslims, who of course are already people of color, Latino Muslims, South Asians and others, but even people like me who the census says are white. So I'm Arab, my parents are Palestinian, I'm white, believe it or not. I wish I had the privilege that came with that, but unfortunately I don't. But I will say about Islam has become racialized in this country. So the government policies that are being created that target American Muslims, whether they be dragnet surveillance programs, policies at airports, border interrogations, all the different no-fly lists, watch lists, you name it. We as a faith community have all been racialized. So it doesn't matter if we're white or black or South Asian. The fact that we are Muslim or have Muslim names or look Muslim, we have become a racialized community in this country, which for me is also extremely problematic. And it's something that I want to leave with you for food for thought. So thank you very much for having me here. I hope that I wasn't too all over the place. I'm still drying from the nice little wet walk that I had to Union. Thank you, Union, for having me here.
Thank you. I have to say, Linda, I admired your approach because you spoke for 12 and a half minutes, but it's going to take us 20 minutes to hear what you said, right? The fourth panelist, John Tatamanel, is going to, I don't know if John's going to give a rejoinder or offer observations, but we're always delighted to hear you, so come on up, John.
I want to begin by thanking you all for being here. Your presence and dedication to come to an event on an evening like this is an indication of your commitment to the cause of interreligious encounter and peacemaking, and also your commitment to rigorous thinking about complex issues. So I think we recognize what it means that so many of you have elected to come. Now, going forth in America means that you are batting cleanup. or at least that's the role for those of you who are baseball fans. I know we're in the middle of the World Series right now, so some of you might be thinking about that sport. But given the power of our preceding speakers, I won't aim for the fences. We had a very illustrious and distinguished panel. I hope perhaps at best to lay down a clean bunt. These metaphors don't seem to be working.
You don't know anything about it. They're very American. But
Yeah, these are very American metaphors. Yes. But I am going to ask a very hard question, a question that is to some measure uncomfortable making, namely precisely the question of the panel. Now, conversations of late in the public media have begun with questions like, is Islam a religion of war or a religion of peace? This question has been recently discussed as a result of the now infamous interview with Bill Maher. The argument on this question continues to rage furiously and will continue to do so on the internet for some time. But there is another question, a prior question, that is often asked by a variety of Islamophobes. Is Islam even a religion? We know, and our speakers have already indicated, that those who pose this question do so primarily for malicious purposes. They would like for us to say that Islam is not a religion in order to deprive Muslims of constitutional protections. This point has already been made. If Islam is not a religion, then we need not guarantee freedom of religion to Muslims. Now, here's where things might get difficult for us collectively. Now, just because right-wingers and Islamophobes ask a question for malicious reasons does not mean that the question itself is worthless or misguided. Scholars must have the courage to confront difficult, awkward, and painful questions while seeking to guard against the uses to which our research might be put. So then I propose that we must indeed ask if Islam is a religion. But first, I think we must slow down and move ourselves into a realm of subtlety and complexity. A kind of subtlety and complexity that those who ask this question in the public sphere failed to muster. We must ask the question of definition. Just what is a religion, anyhow? Is Christianity a religion? How about Judaism? How about Hinduism? Are these traditions religions, and self-evidently so? Have they always been religions? If not, when did they become religions? The answers to these questions, I would venture, are by no means transparent or self-evident. In my brief remarks today, I just want to frame some of the complexities that we must ponder together collectively as we face up to these questions. I want to join with a host of voices working in the wake of the scholar Talal Asad, who have argued that our prevailing ideas about religion are of relatively recent vintage. Although the term religion is of antique vintage and its uses can be traced all the way back to Rome, the term as we use it today carries a number of meanings that are uniquely modern. Most significantly, our ideas about religion presuppose that the religious can be neatly and cleanly and absolutely separated from something else that we call the secular. Indeed, for us moderns and even many postmoderns, when we say the word religion, we mean that which is other than the secular. And when we say the word secular, we mean that which is other than the religious. Here's what Assad has to say about this. I'm quoting him. I would urge that religion is a modern concept because it has been linked to its Siamese twin, secularism. I really love that phrase, that religion and secularism are Siamese twins, conceptual Siamese twins. Religion, and now he gets into scholarly discourse, bear with me a little bit, it's worth hearing. Religion has been part of the restructuration of practical times and spaces, a rearticulation of practical knowledges and powers of subjective behaviors, sensibilities, needs, and expectations in modernity. But that applies equally to secularism, whose function has been to try to guide the re-articulation and to define religions in the plural as a species of non-rational belief. To define religion as a species of non-rational belief. Now let me unpack the verbosity of scholarly discourse. Try to speak English. Assad calls religion and the secular Siamese twins because you cannot think one without thinking the other. Still more, Assad is saying that what we mean by secularity or the secular is just that set of complex historical processes by which we invented something called religion and defined it as a species of non-rational belief. If Assad is right, and I believe he is, we cannot have religion in our modern sense prior to the rise of the secular. The invention of the secular is simultaneously the invention of religion. The meaning and sense of one term requires the other as its contrast term. Hence, the secular is not the religious is not the secular. What is key to the conversation we're having now, is understanding that this process of discriminating between the secular and the religious is neither universal in terms of time or space. Not all societies, nor all time periods, would have recognized this distinction as meaningful. Many of us in the West, by contrast, seem unable to think without these categories. Sometimes I suggest that the invention of the category religion and its export may be the West's most successful cultural commodity. The creation, the invention, and the dissemination of the notion of religion. We seem incapable of thinking apart from these two categories, and we take these categories to be part of the architecture of our thinking. We take them for granted, and they are part of the way we make sense of the world. And we even, therefore, take these categories to be transtemporally and cross-culturally valid. But the distinction is invented, and therefore we must pay attention to the processes of what the Sikh scholar Arvind Mandar calls the processes of religion making. And here again some academic discourse, but it's very useful. We conceive of religion making broadly as the way in which certain social phenomena are configured and reconfigured within the matrix of a world religion's discourse. In other words, the notion refers to the reification and institutionalization of certain ideas, social formations, and practices as religious, in the conventional Western meaning of the term, thereby subordinating them to a particular knowledge regime of religion and its political, cultural, philosophical, and historical interventions. Inhale. Quite a long sentence. Again, let me translate. He says that religion making, the invention of religion, is a part of a complex series of historical processes by which we have learned to designate some parts of our lives as not religious and some other parts of our lives as religious. What does this mean? Typically it has meant this in the West, that the realm of the political, the realm of the economic, and the realm of the social, broadly defined, these things we have come to believe, we have come to learn, come to think of these matters as belonging to the space of the secular. Economics, presumably, is a secular matter. Politics is presumably a secular matter. The social, broadly defined, is a secular matter. And each of these ought to be governed and regulated by the intellectuals who are the custodians of that realm. Economists tell us what ought to obtain in the world of economics. Political theorists, presumably, in the realm of politics and so forth. So what's left for religion? This is a really interesting question. What belongs to the sphere of the religious properly? When we accuse fundamentalists or entire traditions, such as Islam, of confusing the political with the religious, what are we saying and meaning by the word religious? That is to say, what's left when the political, the economic, and the social are subtracted? It seems to me that what's left is some notion of a privatized, transcendentalized something. That is to say, it seems to be our encounter, human encounter, often in the realm of inward experience, with a transcendent, extra-mundane reality, like God or Brahman, right? Our personal encounter with the transcendent, this alone gets to qualify as the religious. I'm simplifying a bit, but so religion then is relegated to the sphere of interiority, to the sphere of the private, and everything public has now become the sphere of the secular. The private's encounter with the transcendent, the flight of the alone to the alone, that is religious. It seems to me then that the social arrangement under which we operate in the West, or many of us like to think we operate under, is that you can believe anything you want about the soul's relationship to the transcendent. That's freedom of religion. But if you say anything about the political, the economic, if you happen to think perhaps that the question of how much interest should be charged, or whether interest should be charged at all, the minute you start asking questions like that, you have violated the boundaries that we like to draw between what we take to be religious and what we take to be secular. We in the West, and Islamophobes in particular, I think are onto something about the nature of Islam. That in many parts of the world, Islam has refused to be religionized, which in my mind means refused to be domesticated. It has, that is to say, Islam as a tradition that aspires towards social justice wants to make robust claims about matters political, matters economic, and matters social. The thing is, Christians and Jews do it all the time. That is to say, both on the right and the left, Christians and Jews are also always making claims about the nature of the proper order of the political, the social, and the economic. So we have accepted, to some considerable extent in the West, the processes by which many of our traditions have learned to represent themselves as religions. But in our actual mode of living, the notion that Christians and Jews don't actually engage in the political realm in robustly political ways is a fiction. Mm-hmm. And increasingly, political theorists are beginning to tell us that if the modern period is defined by this discrimination between the secular and the religious, and that compact is no longer working, then we must rethink from the ground up the processes by which we have come to accept these traditions as religions. I think Islam can be a resource for us because it has, at least many Muslims, recognized that it is problematic to accept certain configurations of the religious, particularly these domesticated definitions of the religious as a kind of flight of the alone to the alone, or what Whitehead calls a man's relationship, what a man does with his solitariness. These are inadequate definitions of religion. And none of us actually accept these definitions in terms of the ways in which we actually comport ourselves in political life here in America. Perhaps we can have a robust conversation with Muslims, with a number of us, about what to do if the category of religion, as we've come to use it, no longer seems viable to us. What might the future hold on the other side of this distinction between the religious and the secular? Now that's a hard question, but it's a question that union people ask all the time, because no liberation theologian is willing to accept this domesticated account about the nature of religion.
Thank you. And I want to thank all of our panelists for really enormous food for thought. For me, the proof of the success of this panel is I thought I knew what I was going to do now. and I'm just so full of ideas and thoughts about everything you've said that what I was hoping to challenge you with, I've thrown out the window. The first thing I want to say is the ushers, I see them back there preparing. Yes, thank you. They're going to be passing around index cards. If you have questions, they have pencils as well, I think. Write them down, and once your question is written down, they'll come around and collect them, and during the conversation, I will sort through them so that I can represent your questions to the panel. But I get to start. And I want to start with the dilemma that what all four of you spoke about just intensified for me in horrible ways. Because much of what you said today about how people think about Islam, not so very long ago, within living memory, was said about Judaism in this country. So imagine how distressed I am now when a classmate of mine who was ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary in the same year I was, a classmate of mine just 3 weeks ago, on the holiday of Rosh Hashanah, gave a sermon in Atlanta in which he said he opened by saying, 3 years ago I preached kommt, using Yiddish. He's coming for us. And now I tell you da, which is in fact bad Yiddish, but all right, we'll forgive him. He didn't grow up in a Yiddish-speaking home. He's here now. Who is the boogeyman of this sermon? Islam. My classmate says, experts tell us. He repeats this 3 different times in the sermon. Experts tell us that really no more than 5% of Islam are terrorists. He said, and when I first thought about that, I was reassured. 95% of Islam are not terrorists. He said, but then I did some math, and 5% of 1 billion people is 50 million terrorists coming for us. They're here today waiting for us. And then he asks the question that a number of you raised, so where are all the Muslims standing up to condemn this? He went on fulminating. And I'm sorry to say that it was one of those rare sermons that the congregation actually stood up and applauded. This is very sad to me, and a group of my colleagues and I have, on email over the last few days, been discussing, what do we do? Should we take him on in public? Because it's going to be a very muddy fight. One of my colleagues said, we have to take him on rationally and with dignity. And I said, well, we might be able to do rationally, but I don't think there's going to wind up being a lot of dignity in mud wrestling. I'm distressed by it, and of course I denounce it. I go to congregations, Jewish synagogues, all the time and talk about relations between Judaism and Islam, and I have a lot of good stuff to report. And I get 2 reactions. The first one is, why don't I know about this, right? This is Linda's question. Why don't I know about this? So of course, the real answer, why don't you know about it, is because you're an idiot, right? Because you haven't been doing your homework. Because when you saw an article about Judaism and Islam in the paper, you skimmed over it rather than read it. But you can't really say that to people. The other thing is, after I finished telling them how I've literally traveled the world, met with heads of state of Islamic majority countries, met with Muslims all over New York, met with the leadership of the Islamic Society of North America here in the country, and someone will stand up and say, Rabbi, you're not living in reality. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I read an article on the internet. I was like, okay. How do you even begin to address it? And I'm concerned. I'm concerned with what Ehrman said, I'm concerned with what Jerusalem said, and I'm concerned with what John said. Linda, I think, is, she's from Brooklyn. She gets it. What I'm concerned with is that we academics, and I'll include myself, we academics, we believe in reasoned argument. We believe in, I think I'm using your words, subtlety, nuance. And no one is going to listen to us. Basically what they're asking about Islam is, when did you stop beating your wife? right? Well, that's not the question you ever want to have to answer, because the question immediately puts you on the defensive. So I'm asking you, advise me as a rabbi, what do I do with this horrible colleague of mine who's out there spewing hate and who obviously has insufficient knowledge of Jewish history, because if he had knowledge of Jewish history, he would know that not very long ago, people were saying the same awful things he's saying about Islam about us. Doesn't he hear himself? So how do you respond to that? And, John, let's start with you, because you wanted to, problematize, and I think, intellectually, you're on very solid ground. You want to problematize even the question of religion. And, I don't know who's going to listen to that.
Why did I have to be first?
Doesn't it say somewhere in the New Testament, he who is last shall be first?
Yeah. In this case, it doesn't work so well. No, I think you're asking an earnest and serious question that goes, I think, beyond either matters of tactics or strategy. You're asking about questions about how deep transformative change happens. And that is, again, increasingly becoming evident to us that in many cases information doesn't provide change. We're discovering, apparently over the last couple of weeks, that when people are presented information about climate change, it actually doesn't, to climate deniers, it actually just reinforces their climate denial. So there are all manner of ways in which we are beginning to understand that social transformation does not come by means of information alone. This is a very difficult thing for an academic to have to confess, since we're basically often in the position of introducing new ideas. So my guess is that something like an intellectual equivalent of nonviolent resistance as a change strategy must be deployed. How does one transform the hater, those who seek to exercise violence? Isn't that the question that we're deeply asking ourselves? And isn't that question precisely what those who are trying to engage in strategies of nonviolent resistance are attempting to deploy?
So
that's the sort of
let me push this a little, because Ehrman, I think, nailed something very powerful. You used the term the meme, right? The repetition. When I was a kid, they used to call it the big lie, right? You repeat it often enough and people begin to believe it. And in this country, the media, and the media across the board, because they love conflict, it's in their interest to repeat the big lie that Islam is violent, that Islam is not a religion. We can fill in all the awful blanks that they do. And Ehrman, you were honest enough to admit that most people who hold opinions like this aren't going to let the facts get in the way, exactly what John said. So how do we engage John's, nonviolent resistance? Where do we begin?
Is that a question that I have to answer?
No, by the way, you don't have to answer it, but the fate of Islam in America depends on it.
Okay.
Yikes.
Well, now that I have shoulder responsibility for the fate of the world and humanity, I think perhaps nonviolent resistance and strategies can be employed. But I also believe in human contact. I also believe in communication, in personal relationships. I believe that when people get to know one another, it is not that all of the questions will be resolved and that all hatred is going to disappear and that all misunderstandings are magically going to just vanish. But I do believe that people will develop a sort of empathy, that they would develop a sort of understanding that can be only gained through personal interaction, because I think that for many Americans, because number of Muslim Americans or Muslims in America or American Muslims is still relatively low and concentrated often in some metropolitan areas or even in some smaller cities, but not as widely spread, that Muslims, for most Americans, are some sort of an abstract concept. It's not a person that you went to school with. It's not a person that you see every day in the grocery store. It's not your teacher, your child's teacher. It's not. Well, it often is your medical doctor, but maybe you do not notice that.
My engineering teacher.
Yeah. So all these kind of things, I think that we need to change that perception. That perception can be changed to personal interaction. Now, again, I don't want to be too naive or idealistic to say that this is going to solve all the problems, but I think it goes a long way in
I think there's something here about domesticating, as it were, that a lot of people see Islam as alien. Linda repeated this often charge that Islam is not part of America. I was at a iftar at the White House when the President of the United States said it point blank. He said, as long as there's been a United States of America, there have been Muslims as part of America. And, we have to own that. Of course, it's the current president who said it, and everybody thinks he's a Muslim anyway, right? That's because he is also pushed to the other. But I want to come to something, Jerusha. This is the second time we've been on these kind of panels together, and I'm always impressed that your passion is driven not only as a Muslim, but as a feminist. And it strikes me that what we're about here is both doing what Ehrman is talking about and what Jerusha yearns for, which is an American Islam. That the more Islam domesticates itself, the more that there is, and here I, speaking to somebody from IIIT, the possibility of an Islamic Theological Seminary of America, says the guy from the Jewish Theological Seminary, right? The more that there are Muslim leaders who are trained in our idiom rather than being trained in, Al-Azhar or Pakistan or Saudi, the better chance there is for people to say, Islam, I know that. That's familiar. So I want to ask Jerusha, is feminism a way of introducing Islam to America through a discourse that we're now familiar with for 40 years?
Yes, that's not the question I want to answer, but I will answer that question. So let me just say that I want to push back on something. And it's one of the things that I actually was going to talk about, but you always prepare too many things to talk about and then you pick and choose. But I am slightly suspicious of the domestication narrative. I'm slightly suspicious of the idea that if we are enough like you, or I'm enough like me, or I don't know where, I said those slippery us's and thems, that then I'm acceptable. So if I am similar enough to what you know and are familiar with and value already, that then you can value me. I think that that's a difficult narrative. Now, I hadn't intended to make this connection explicit, but that sounds really scary when you talk about Muslims because they're foreign and other and different and the them out there. But this is the basis of all liberation and feminist theological thought. I don't have to be like you to be valuable. That's patriarchy. That's what men have told women forever. You have to be like me if you want to have value. And you can, by the way, you can't ever be like me, but keep trying. And that is if we put that narrative on top of the narrative of Muslims and Islams, it's a no-win situation. It's so funny. I meant to say this to Linda before we got on the panel, but so I'll just say in a public forum. I saw something online when she did hijabi monologues, which is, kind of like the vagina monologues, but it's a takeoff on that and Muslim women talking about experience. And there's something she said at the end of that where she kind of talked about just wanting to be able to be like mad at somebody in public and be able to be counted just as a person who was having a bad day and not, another bad Muslim. And I think that for me, what is so important is that I don't know if feminism is the way to introduce that, but these dialogues of liberation might well be, because this is the justice narrative. It's a justice issue across the board. But what I long for is a day when you can just be having a bad day, or you can just be like a bad person, but it not be attributed to your Islam. You could just be,
Linda, will you jump in now? Because this, this is your discourse. This is Brooklyn.
Oh, I'm thinking about a whole like bunch of things right now. I just wanted to share a quick story about this idea of this changing of the hearts and minds, and I think people underestimate the importance of that and how far that goes along. When Hurricane Sandy happened, we live in Bay Ridge, and one of the first things we did within the first 2 days after Hurricane Sandy is we went to Midland Beach, Staten Island. We took a whole bunch of cars, we parked in like a random intersection in Midland Beach, water everywhere. Nobody had electricity, nothing. And what we did was we ordered pizza. We ordered like 60 pies of pizza that came to us at this intersection. So we were all volunteers, we were partners, we'd knock on your door and we'd just be like, hey, would you want a hot pizza for dinner? Because people didn't have gas and they didn't have electricity. So I knock on this one lady's door. She opens the door a little bit. She was about like in her 50s, a white woman, and she was like, you know, peeking at me through the door. So I was like, hey, hi, do you want some pizza for dinner? And she opens the door and she starts to apologize to me. She's like, I didn't know. She's like, I'm so sorry. I was like, the hell is this lady talking about? Am I allowed to say hell in that seminar? I'm just kidding. She continued to apologize, and my colleague was holding the pizza. I took the pizza. She opened the door. I gave her the pizza, and she's like, look, I just didn't know. She's like, I really want to apologize. So what was she apologizing for? She was one of the leaders of the folks that were opposing the building of the Midland Beach Mosque in Staten Island. And all it took for me was some Muslim girl to come to her door with a hot pizza. And of course, I didn't go to her door knowing who she was. So I think this human contact piece is really important because a lot of the Pew surveys say like 58% of people have non-favorable views of Muslims is because when you ask the next question, they never met a Muslim before. But I also wanted to jump in on this, this question that the last, definitely not least speaker talked about. Sorry, I'm still trying to remember people's names. About this question again about, is it a valid question? So my thing when you talk about changing the hearts and minds of people is that there are people that you're never going to be change their hearts, right? So you try, you might go to your colleague, and be like, let's have a conversation. Let me introduce you to some Muslims. Let's go out and have some dinner or something like that. Let's have a conversation. Let's do some community service projects together or something like that. But eventually there are going to be people who you do not change their mind. Me personally, I don't live in this world to change the minds of people who I know his minds are not going to be changed. And most often people who ask, is Islam a religion, are not people who are going to sit down and have a conversation to really understand whether or not Islam is a religion. They have made a conclusion. That question is not a question, it is a statement. So the question is, do we focus on those folks, right? Or do we try to go into the middle for those folks that maybe have never had any human contact with a Muslim in, in like somewhere in Arkansas or something like that. But even those who have had interactions with Muslim have had either, passed them by in the train station or something really brief. So I think that's really important. And just one last thing on the feminism piece of it. Is feminism an acceptable discourse in this country either? Just the other day, they like that Gamergate, someone basically threatened to come shoot up a place that was hosting this feminist panel that happened at a university. Like feminism also, we have to be careful to make it sound like in the United States of America, we're like the, empowerers of women. I mean, for God's sakes, we're still fighting for equal pay. Like I'm not sure if that's the discourse.
So let me try a different analogy then, because, and I don't know if it's a reliable analogy, but I know that it can often be a problematic analogy, certainly in certain pious Muslim circles. Does Islam in America have a lesson to learn from gay liberation? There used to be a time that no one talked about gays at all, and then I don't remember what TV show it was, Ellen, something like that. Ooh, there was a gay on TV, right? And I think now, I say that, of course, living in New York City, but I think now people are just a whole lot more relaxed about gay people in America. It's just not as problematic as it once was. And I say this knowing full well that gays are still bullied, that it's not without problems. But it has been enormous progress. Let me give another example, and this is an example from our friend Ibu Patel. Ibu remembers, although he's far too young to actually remember it personally, but I'm not, when Jack Kennedy ran for president. You all know who Jack Kennedy was? You've heard of him? Okay. I teach now that the students I teach, I taught their fathers. So, I get a lot of blank stares when I reveal my age. But Ibu said, when Jack Kennedy ran for president, there was an enormous, powerful, anti-Catholic discourse. He'll take orders from the Pope. They're seeking to take over America. Not unlike what we hear. And I can tell you, because when Jack Kennedy ran for president, that same discourse was going on about Jews. And Ibu said, you know, so he's optimistic. I said, you're optimistic? He says, yeah. Look, 50 years later, Jack Kennedy, alas, is gone. But nobody's complaining about Catholics in America. Look at the Supreme Court. No Protestants at all Jews and Catholics. So, inshallah, you know, 50 years from now, we'll look at the Supreme Court, and there will be Muslim jurists on the Supreme Court, there will be gay jurists on the Supreme Court, et cetera, et cetera. That is to say, democracy is a slow, painful, long process, which we have to fight for constantly. Do those analogies work for you? And Jerusha,
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm a little jumping out of my
seat.
seat. So I've heard Ibu say this, and I have heard other people make this analogy, you know, just kind of say it's Muslims' turn, you know, it's your turn, like we're being jumped into the gang, for lack of a better reference. You know, you have to be kind of beat up enough until you can earn your, it's hazing. And I guess because maybe I do think sometimes through a theological, but even a public square theological lens, I just wonder what that says about us. Like, can we never get it right? Can we never learn to treat people well? And so, yes, I agree with the optimism that we'll probably find someone else to demonize. But what does that say about us? I mean, what is that honestly? For me, that is a profoundly disappointing depiction of us as human beings. And I just think that is not acceptable. That is not something to aspire to, and I won't sit down and take that, even with optimism. It's not acceptable. And we have to start to learn that is just the case.
I want to interrupt because I know many of you have, I've been watching people writing questions, so I'm going to ask the ushers, who are already collecting some of them, bring them up so that I can see what's what. Someone had a very long question. So, Jerusha, I appreciate your point, and I think we all, I mean, judging by the applause, we all agree with it. Like, can't we just all get along? Right?
We can debate until the end of time, but let's not treat each other like less than human beings.
But since the beginning of time, we have done that.
Yeah.
So do you really think that it's in your power or in John's power or any of our power as educators, as human beings, as activists, to change human nature? That's the question that any one of you can jump on me for.
I don't think that's our human nature. I guess theologically I would push back on it.
All right, say it again, because I think it's important for everybody to hear.
No, I just don't think that is, I think that's also just a theological question. I don't think that is our human nature. And my stance on Islamic theology, without going in depth, and I know a lot of my students are here and will say, okay, we know what you're talking about. I just don't think that is the core of our nature. I think that is our degraded nature. Our dehumanization of people is what we have done perpetually, but I don't think that is what we are called to do or created to do. We are created for much more. And we fail to live up to it repetitively, but that does not get us off the hook. We are responsible. And so when you want to talk about the blending into it, here, let me blend away. Okay, I'm not going to respect any of those secular religious boundaries in this. We are called for better. We are here for better. And that's my theological perspective, but I think other people might share some ruminations with that.
Erma?
Well, I would go back to my last point, which is that uphill steep road. I mean, it was never meant to be easy. It was never meant to be smooth sailing. It was never meant to be a smooth ride. It's going to take a lot of struggle. And I agree with Jerusha on the concept of human nature, and that this is our degraded nature. We have a higher nature that we have to aspire to, and that uphill steep road is that road that leads to that higher nature. Exactly, that was the Quranic, parable example that was put toward that. So it requires each and every one of us to transcend ourselves to a point. It requires each and one of us to put an effort and not just become an observer in this world and let others take hold of the discourse and control it and make us hate, no matter who that is, Muslims, Jews, all kinds of different people that are different than us. And I would like to come back just briefly to a point that Linda made, and that is racialization of Islam in America. You can be as white as, what would be the good metaphor in English? I'm kind of looking for it.
Tea party.
Snow, as white as a snow. If you're a Muslim, you're not seen as white. If you're a Muslim, not seen as white, or if you're white, you're not seen as a Muslim. And I'll give you an example. After 9/11, whenever I would travel to different countries, usually Muslim-majority countries, people would ask me, so how is it for Muslims now after 9/11? And I would say, yeah, there is a lot of negative discourse, but I would say I personally never experienced anything. And usually the answer that I got, and I never thought about it, is because you're white. And because your name doesn't sound Muslim. So when you're at the airport and your name is Ermin Sinanovic and you are from Europe, nobody thinks you're Muslim. So I was never detained or questioned at the airport, and I hope nobody's watching this and saying, well, we should do it for the first time. But that's exactly precisely it. If my name was Ahmed Ibrahim and I was slightly darker, I'm sure I would have been stopped so many times by now. And I never really thought of that. And at that moment, I really wanted, in a way, to say to myself, you know what, because I'm Muslim, I want to be stopped at the airport. I want to see what my brothers and sisters are going through all the time, because I've never experienced it. I've never experienced that hardship just because of the way I look. And I realized, and I never thought until it was pointed, you know, that it was so racialized, and it is so racial and racist. And that was an interesting point that I learned.
And that taps into, you know, a recurrent American theme, for sure. I want to bring two of the audience questions minimally to you. And one is, for all of you, that none of us really address the issue of fear, that inherent fear is causing people to lash out. How do you begin to address that? I mean, aside from laying down on your back and putting your paws up in the air and saying, you know, rub my tummy.
Well, I think we are watching, and it's impossible to miss, that there are agents involved in our public discourse that are manufacturing fear. And this needs to be analyzed. I think Fox News understands well that social change happens when one's affect is in some deep way triggered. And one of the most powerful ways of triggering affect is by triggering fear. So if we, and I think I'm echoing points made by many people, many of my fellow panelists, if we work only at the level of cognition, we are probably doomed. This doesn't mean that you don't have to do rigorous work of the sort that I think we need also to do. But intelligence can also be marshaled for the sake of figuring out how to trigger different affect. I want to, for example, reinforce some of the points made on here by citing the work of the scholar Ashutosh Varshney. Varshney did a compelling book called Ethnic Conflict and Civic Life in India, in which he argued, which he asked a simple question. When acts of violence happen in India, and it's triggered, say, by an act of a radical Muslim, why do some cities explode into Hindu-Muslim conflict and others remain very peaceful? And Ashutosh Varshney, and I'm simplifying his conclusions, saw that in those cities there were intense face-to-face encounters with and between Hindus and Muslims. And in civic organizations, there were important civic organizations that routinely brought Hindus and Muslims together. So we address fear by changing affect, by doing the sort of thing that Linda had spoken about, by bringing people into face-to-face encounters and then using mass media to generate other affects that are more powerful perhaps than fear.
So the answer to fear is pizza delivery.
It might well be.
It might well be.
So
Everything might be.
I just want to close with one last question, which struck me very powerfully. And it struck me powerfully because actually the last time Jerusha and I did an event together, we were invited not far from here, down at 114th Street, to an Episcopal school, St. Hilda and St. Hugh's. And we were invited by their new chaplain, who is a friend of mine, to give blessings to the children as they began their school year. So Jerusha came and quoted Quran, and I came and cheated because I said, it happens to be historically accurate, but I said that in Jewish tradition, when kids begin learning, they get candy, and I gave out candy. That's the equivalent of pizza. How do we teach our children? I see you walk down the street with Jalila, and I always think that, like, the two of you together are just this unbreakable bond. How do you teach your children not to hate? How do you teach your children not to fear? How do you teach your children to love your neighbor as yourself?
As I mentioned in my remarks, I said the buses, and you see them on the street, just saw one with my daughter. Well, I just saw one of them. They're much smaller than I envisioned. Yesterday with my daughter walking home. And she is very, well, I don't need to explain her, those of you who know. She's very insightful in a way. And she read the sign on herself, and her question to me was, what do they mean by Islamorealism? She's 8. I don't really know, but you could fill me in later. But her response, I think, is an answer to the question. Her response is, Mommy, why would someone do that? Why would you do that? There's just not we teach people to hate. And we have to be attentive to the subtle and silent and implicit and latent messages that we give off through body language, through comments, through rhetoric, whether explicit or implied. We have to be attentive to what we do to teach them to hate. But I just don't see it. That's not programmed. What's programmed is, why would you do that? Why would you want to make people feel like that? And why would you put it on a bus where people go? We have to work from the other angle of not messing up.
Linda, you want to?
So I have 3 children too. My kids are 15, 14, and 10 years old. And something that my parents didn't do with me that I do with my children is that my parents taught me Islam. They taught me that I had to like pray 5 times a day, and I fast in Ramadan, and here's who my prophet is, and all these very like fundamental like ABCDs of Islam. But what they didn't really what I felt like my parents didn't teach me was the idea that Islam is also about the way that I carry myself and the way that I treat others. I mean, obviously my parents taught me manners and things like that, but they didn't really integrate it into my Islamic teaching. And then as an activist, I think what really speaks to my children is about what makes them proud to be Muslim is not that they pray 5 times a day or that we have the best religion in the world. What makes them proud is that the kind of positions and stance that we take on things. And as an activist, for example, like recently, I talked to my kids. I'm a police reform activist in New York City. And when I talk to my kids, and I take them to a rally and I take them to the front of Romali Graham's, building where he lived. And I tell my kids that this young boy went into his apartment and he got shot in the bathroom unarmed in front of his grandmother and 8-year-old brother. And we start talking about that, is that right? Is that wrong? Like, what do we do to make sure this doesn't happen? And immediately the young kids are like, that's wrong. Like, that shouldn't happen. Like, why did they do that? And then I start bringing my kids to these conversations and bringing them, with me to showing them, families whose parents have been deported, and my kids getting the sense and idea of the wrong that is around us that they have to talk about. And when recently when Ferguson happened, and I've been having these discussions with my kids for, as long as they can actually speak and understand, and respond. And I was watching my son's Twitter account all by himself, and he has a little Instagram account that I monitor. And my son by himself is like tweeting left and right, like he was 40 years old, talking about justice and how Mike Brown deserved to be justice, and we can't keep treating black people in our country like this. And well, I'm not surprised because we, live in a country where slavery was legal. I was blown away. So when I asked my son, I'm like, what do you think about what's happening in Ferguson? He's like, Mom, he's like Islam teaching, like he was teaching me about what my religion, that I've been following all my life, that I've only recently understood is really a religion about justice. And this is what we teach our young people, and even young people that come into my organization, the idea that religion is not just something that you do on the side, that is how you carry yourself every single day. And I think it's important that we teach young people, because young people, there's that picture that we always see, that meme. Your kid doesn't come out of you racist. Like, people aren't born to hate, right? They have to be taught to hate. So it is our responsibility as adults, and to be honest with you, the adults are the ones that are the problems, not our young people are not the problem. It's adults that are problems. So I think that for me, it's been teaching and having conversations that we don't have with young people about justice, about faith. What does it mean to be faithful? Does faithful mean praying, going to like synagogue on Friday? Is that what it means? Just because someone goes to pray Friday prayer every Friday, does that make them the most pious Muslim? For me, the most pious Muslim is the one that takes their faith, their prayer, their fasting, and brings that together with working on social justice issues. If you're not working on social justice issues and you don't care about your neighbors and the people oppressed around you, I question your iman and your faith.
All right, I'm very sensitive to time, but I want to give both airmen a chance to respond, and then at the very end, we're going to ask John to lay down a really clean bunt. Okay.
I think, I mean, this is such a vast topic. I would like to just go back to something Jerusha said, and I do agree with her on the issue that somehow if Muslims become domesticated in this environment, and that was an earlier question that you asked, that all of our problems are going to be solved, but we need to be precisely able to transcend that, to be able to appreciate diversity and differences. It is not the goal to make everyone uniform and same. It is about accepting people as different as they are into our fold. I think that should be our goal. And I will give you one example of something that was and has been and is domesticated, but is not being talked about, or we do not use it in our education. When I used to teach at Naval Academy in Annapolis, I would often walk through downtown, and this is a quintessential American, old, small, colonial town with one of the most powerful institutions that this country has produced. And there is a small memorial in the center of downtown Annapolis, and that is Alex Haley Kunta Kinte Memorial, from, of course, Roots fame. Well, not everybody knows that. I mean, so the older generation will remember Roots and all of that. Kunta Kinte was a Muslim. That is as clear in the Roots as it is. So you have this quintessential American small town that has in its center a memorial that is named after a Muslim, and yet somehow that part of his Muslim identity is never mentioned. So it is a part of America, but it's a part of America that is still an unknown, that is still not being explored, that is still not being brought to the fore. I think we need to do that. We need to make it clear, to make it open, to make it real, as they say.
Hard to top that. I'm reminded that one of the themes that seems to have emerged from this conversation is precisely, as I said earlier, the question of affect. I'm reminded in particular in this respect about a variety of Muslim comedians that I've seen. There's a variety of movements of this sort of subtle sort to, again, not domesticate. A good comedy never domesticates. But that sort of approach, that commitment to humanizing, not necessarily domesticating, seems to be an important piece of the work. But I still want to insist that we also need to ask hard questions about how we structure public discourse. If public discourse prevents us from bringing into play our most deepest and cherished commitments, our faith commitments, our ideas about justice as they're shaped by our convictions, our scriptures, our traditions, then our public discourse is impoverished. So long as we insist that the religious has to be left out of public discourse, I think our public discourse will be emaciated. So let's begin to ask even this awkward question: are any of our traditions religions? And see what can come from a way of envisioning public space that permits us to be human together.
I want to thank you, and I want to thank Serene for letting Union be the place of this public discourse. I think everyone viewing in the streaming and everyone here in the room would say that this is a public discourse that we've just witnessed that enlightens and helps America become a better country. Thank you. Thank you all.
Not only am I running the room, but then my
I'm used this from time to time, not being in a,
in a school and
well, like in your 30, I see you. You do have, you're trying to reach out and bring people.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome.
Oh, thank you for doing this. This was great.